Okay, magandang gabi po mga katipon dito sa Pilipinas. At ito po ang ating katipunan. Muling sumasa inyo mga tagapakinig. Probably, I think for the first time in 2022, upang magbigay ng mahalagang impormasyon, magbigay liwanag, at higit sa lahat, ay makinig sa inyong mga daing at kuro-kuro hinggil sa mga problemang patuloy na nagpapahirap sa ating kalagayan at kabuhayan. Sa susunod na oras, 2 oras, sisikapin po namin ipaliwanag ang iba-ibang bahagi ng ating ekonomiya at mga mabibigat na lokal at international issues na may malaking epekto sa ating buhay at kinabukasan. Ito po ang inyong katipon na si Butch Valdes. Kasama po natin dito si Itos na co-host natin at iba pa natin mga kasamahan sa katipon mula sa Save the Nation Movement, Philippine LaRouche Society at ng Partido Politikal na Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino. Kami po rito ay nag-aanyaya sa inyo na makibahagi sa ating talakayan sa pagsusuri ng mga kasalukuyang problema at paghahanap ng kaukulang solusyon. Okay, today is January 23 of the year 2022. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is our first show of Ating Katipunan for this year, no? Because things have been very hectic, a lot of things are happening, a lot of goings on in many different facets of our lives, no? So I can see that Itos is here, but he doesn't have his camera on his picture. It's a good-looking picture. Yeah. Oh, there it is. So Itos is there as a new. He has a new haircut. Fits him very well. Sama po natin dito. At marami po tayong tatalakayan. Pero since it's the first show of Ating Katipunan this year, I wanted to get our people a world view what is going on outside the Philippines. Kasi medyo alam na natin more or less kung anong nangyayari dito sa atin, sa ating bansa. Marami pong naghahanda sa eleksyon, marami pong naghahanda dito sa mga bagong mga strain ng COVID. Hindi pa po natatapos ng Omicron, para ng Delta, hindi pa natatapos ng Delta, pinag-usapan na yung Omicron. Ngayon, hindi pa natatapos yung Omicron, pinag-uusapan na naman ng iba pang strain. Ang ibig sabihin niyan, siguro, bago ka naman pag-uutos ang ating pamahalaan na magpapabakuna ulit tayo, kinakailangan. At dito nga magkakaroon tayo ng problema ngayon. But hindi po yan ang tatalakayan natin ngayon. Tatalakayan natin ngayon, lalong-lalo na pagdating ng ating kaibigan na si Mike Billington from the United States of America, from the LaRouche movement. Kasama po natin siya at kilalang-kilala po ng ating mga kasamahan dito sa Pilipinas, si Mike Billington. Madalas na po siya pumupunta dito. At ang kanila pong ngayon pinag-iisipan at ginagawa po ng analysis at ginagawa po nila ng hakbang ay ang pagpipigil sana dito sa mga nangyayaring conflicts ng mga malalaking bansa katulad po ng Russia, ng Amerika, ng China, India, Japan, North Korea, Ukraine, the whole of Europe, NATO, magulo pong nangyayari ngayon. At iintayin po natin sana siya na lang ang magbibigay ng ating kwento kung anong nangyayari at tanungan natin kung anong mangyayari at kung ano dapat ang gagawin natin. Itos, bumati ka naman sa ating mga kasamahan.
Yeah, welcome sa mga nanonood sa atin on RMN and on our live stream dito sa Facebook and simulcast on YouTube. As Chairman said, this is our first live show in 2022. Napansin niyo po the past few weeks, we had to replay sometimes because nga dami po nangyayari, and of course since last year, sa pagpanaw ng ating kapatid na si Anton, we binabuti na namin na medyo let's wait a bit while we gather our bearings. But like sabi nga ni Chairman, there's just too much happening already na hindi na tayo pwede mag off the air. We have to start streaming live again. And so we welcome everybody back. We missed you all. And tonight, as Chairman said, we will be having a special guest, an old friend from the LaRouche movement, si Mike Billington. And he will give an overview of what's happening sa mundo. Even if yung pinaka-hot topic natin ngayon is obviously alam na po natin lahat ang nangyayari sa kapaligiran. At medyo tila hindi na maganda ang nangyayari. Medyo dito sa Pilipinas, medyo maasim na ang nangyayari sa atin dito. Lalo na in these past few weeks. All right, so we will of course try and discuss that before Mike Billington comes. So maganda po to kasi Mike will give us an overview of what is happening sa mundo. So dapat yun yung konteksto. And alam po natin na there might be a new leadership. There should be a new leadership this year in May sa election natin. Even if nakikita po natin lahat ng kandidato po, medyo malabo silang lahat. Honestly. So, parang tila hindi nila alam ang nangyayari sa mundo as usual. Very myopic yung kanilang paningin. And it's good that Mike Billington is here to give us the overview of what is happening and what might happen and the tensions that are ongoing around the world. Alam niyo naman po dito sa Ating Katipunan, we always try to give everybody a overview of what's happening in the world, hindi lang po dito. Chairman?
Yes. Tama, mahalaga yung sinasabi mo kanina, Itos, na importanteng maintindihan po ng mga mamamayan natin ang konteksto ng sitwasyon natin sa Pilipinas. Konteksto ng sitwasyon natin sa Pilipinas sa relasyon kung anong nangyayari sa labas ng ating bansa, no? Because a lot is going on around the world, not just the pandemic, not just the global financial system that is now in process of collapsing. Makikita nyo dyan, nagpuputukan yung mga iba-ibang stock market at nagbabagsakan yung mga speculative investments, maraming nagkakandalugi-lugi. At maraming nagduduruan na mag-umpisa ng malawakang giyera. No? Ito yung sitwasyon na pwedeng mangyari, isang malawakang giyera, pag ang mundo ay nagkakaroon ng problema sa ekonomiya, nagbabagsakan ang kanilang halaga ng salapi at ang kahirapan laganap sa buong mundo, nagkakaroon ng social unrest at ang tension between countries tumitindi at tumitindi. Ito ang ating gustong malaman, ano ang mundo natin dito sa Pilipinas. At habang pinapag-usapan natin itong darating na eleksyon, itong mga kandidato, kung ano-ano ang sinasabi, yung kanila bang mga programa ay nakatutok dun sa kinakailangan nating gawin habang ang mundo ay papunta na sa isang malawakan na gera. Yan ang importante natin kailangan malaman. Ngayon, kung papunta tayo doon, ano ba ang kinakailangan natin gawin? Ano ba ang kinakailangan gawin ng ating liderato? At kung yung liderato natin napipiliin dito sa darating na halalan ay may kakayanan na maintindihan ang kalawakan ng problema, hindi lang yung COVID, hindi lang, may intindihan dyan. So, tapos, kung naiintindihan niya yung kalawakan ng problema, ano ang gagawin ng ating bansa, ang ating bayan, no? Para maibsan ang threat to our existence, para mawalang bisa ang mga gustong sumira ng ating buhay at ang ating bayan. No? Yan ang ating pong gustong talakayin mamaya, at lalo na pagdating po ng ating kaibigan na si Mike Billington. No? Darating siya siguro in a few minutes. No? At
gusto ko lang dagdagan, no, Chairman, as sinabi mo. This is happening, alam na po natin, this is happening amidst a global upheaval. Ito po yung nangyayari amidst a global upheaval of citizens in different countries. And this is happening after an imposed lockdown, conceptualized and directed by the WHO in conjunction with many powerful nations that decided that we should lock down the whole world. Okay, and push an experimental medicine on people. Huwag po natin kalimutan na these medicines that people are being forced to take is under emergency use allocation only. Kasi hindi nila to maibigay sa tao bayan if there is no declared pandemic. So nag-declare sila ng pandemic, saka sila nagsabi na kailangan kunin itong gamot, whether we like it or not. Okay, so this is the context that all of this is happening. Dito lang sa Pilipinas, medyo pahirap at pahirap yung mga tao, walang trabaho, lockdown sila ng lockdown. Ngayon, pinipuwersahan sila na kunin yung experimental medicine na tinatawag natin. Okay? And I think I see Mike Billington is online. Mike, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Good morning.
Good evening here. Good morning. Nice to see you, Mike. You look happy and healthy, as always.
And you? And Butch?
yes,
The birthday boy?
Hi, Mike. How are you? Yeah.
Good, Butch. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Well, before anything, I just wanted to please extend my gratitude to all of our friends in the LaRouche organization who have offered their condolences regarding the demise of my son. Another member of the LaRouche organization, Anton, a few months ago. We have
He was widely loved here. He spent a number of months organizing with us, with several of our people who were horrified and shocked to hear, and definitely sent their most heartfelt condolences to all of you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Mike. And as you know, it's not easy. It's not easy losing a son. I don't want it on anybody, including those that are not my friends, no? To have to feel the kind of loss that we did here in our family, myself and Itos particularly, because we worked with Anton very closely on many different areas, and it is such a loss. But we have to go on, and since I said this year, January 23, year 2022 is our first show of this Ating Katipunan, or we came out together. We came out last year, right before New Year, I think, but for 2022. We said we have to get on air, get our people to understand what's going on outside the Philippines. We have been very focused on what's going on here, our coming elections, and so on and so forth. But a lot more has been happening outside the Philippines. And no other person do we go to with regard to this, but our good friend, of course, Mike Billington.
Let me ask first, it says that I need to ask your permission to record this. Do you know what you need to do to give me permission to record it on this side?
Yeah, Ver will be able to give you permission if I.
Okay.
Yeah, well, of course, go ahead, whatever.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So it's an amazing moment in history. There's no question about that. The world is descending into a dark age. There's, especially in the Western world, it's actually quite different in Asia, although there are, as you know, many very, very serious problems in parts of Asia. But in the Western world, we are in the midst of a showdown, literally, between sanity and insanity. There is a push by political forces in England and in the United States, dragging along their so-called allies in Europe, although Europe is totally divided over these issues. But the US and the UK are pushing for a war, a nuclear war. We put out a statement, I'm sure you saw it, called "Are We Sleepwalking into Thermonuclear World War III?" And the answer has to be said, yes. If you only look at the circumstances of the existing political structure and social structure, you'd have to say that, in fact, we are sleepwalking into a war the way we did in World War I. But, of course, we're living now in the age of thermonuclear weapons, and we're talking about the very real potential of the end of civilization as we know it. This attempt to provoke a showdown with both Russia and China, with Russia over Ukraine and with China over Taiwan, has to be seen as madness, absolute madness. It has virtually nothing to do with Ukraine or with Taiwan. This has to do with the fact that the Western financial system, which has been the global system since the end of World War II with the Bretton Woods system, which of course was taken down systemically over the 70s.
This meeting is being recorded.
And through the 90s. This is the cause of this confrontation. The Lords of London, the people who actually run policy in the Western world, centered on the banks in the City of London and on Wall Street, are facing a total collapse, a collapse that actually hit 13 years ago in 2008. And at that time, Lyndon LaRouche, as you know well, had proposed before that breakdown, which he alone had warned was about to hit, but he had also proposed those means that could have prevented that breakdown in 2008, a return to American system policies, a return to the policies that Franklin Roosevelt had implemented towards the end of World War II, which was a return to American system policies, Alexander Hamilton's policies, what LaRouche has always identified as credit policies rather than monetary policies. As distinct from the British Empire, this was a system which recognized that the responsibility of government is to direct the nation's credit into those areas needed for the general welfare, into especially infrastructure and industry and agriculture and the schools and hospitals needed. This is the role of government, to direct credit in the American system. That was completely discarded systemically starting in 1971. And by the time we reached 2008, that system had been virtually dissolved. And we had been taken over by the British system, where the banks themselves, not the government, but the banks themselves had power over the credit of the nation. And because of their foolish policies, it became more profitable for those banks to speculate than to invest in the real economy, to shut down hospitals which were not profitable for the insurance companies in Wall Street, to send our industries overseas to find cheaper labor, to stop building infrastructure. And there has been no building of infrastructure in the United States now for decades. And ultimately, instead of going back to the creditary American system, the decision was made to simply print money in unprecedented numbers to bail out the actually bankrupt financial system. And this is what is causing the war. And people have to recognize that connection. The final phase of this was the so-called Green New Deal, where those same banks who had turned the world financial system into a gambling casino effectively ordered that since governments were not willing to implement the policies needed to save the planet from the fake climate change hysteria, to stop producing carbon in fossil fuels and industry and so forth, the bankers, Mark Carney, Bloomberg, came together and said, governments won't do what's needed. And we bankers, to save the world, are going to take charge and cut credit to industry, to fossil fuels, to agriculture, and divert it into a brand new green bubble whose only purpose is to bail out the banks yet again and to finance the military needed to try to enforce this. So we are now faced with that reality, that they are in a situation where the entire Western financial system is bankrupt, and thinking falsely that the United States is still the world's only superpower, as they falsely believed when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, 1991, thinking that they decided that to maintain this war policy, this speculative policy, they could simply order China and Russia to do their will. And as we're now seeing, the world has changed. This no longer is the case. We no longer are in a world in which there is one superpower lord who can dictate policy for the rest of the world, because we now have China, a larger economy than the United States, a nation, ironically, which is using the American system of economics, the Hamiltonian system, directing credit into those things needed for the uplifting of the population, infrastructure, and industry, and the necessary means for the survival and the livelihood of the population, while the United States has reverted to the British system of allowing the banking institutions to basically loot the country and loot the world. But we have now the role of Russia and China working together, creating a Eurasian force, which is simply saying to the West, no, we're not going to submit to this insanity, to shutting down our economy, to creating conditions which would mean depopulation, to Malthusian policies. And therefore, we're sitting on the precipice. And there's a lot I could say about how the Schiller Institute, the LaRouche organization are pulling together leading forces from around the world to counter this and to put together what is required for building a new system, a new paradigm for mankind based on the idea of peace through development. So I'll stop at that and we can have a discussion.
Right. Well, you mentioned in the beginning, Mike, that the conditions now prevailing around the world, if I might paraphrase it, is moving us towards a new dark age. For many of us, we do not really appreciate what the dark ages were. Could you very briefly give us an idea of what a dark age situation might be in the present world?
Well, if you look, let's take the case of the United States, rather than the more obvious case of some of the third world countries in Africa, especially, which have been left in backwardness. But let's look at the so-called most advanced nation on earth. We have not built any infrastructure, any nuclear power plants. We haven't repaired our roads and bridges. We've sent our industries overseas or simply shut them down, so that we have increasingly a population which not only had increasing unemployment or underemployment, a youth who had no sense of a mission for the future. So this economic decay, sort of slow, systematic decay, which accelerated in 2008 and then really took off in 2019, before the pandemic, by the way. The financial system was exploding in the fall of 2019, before the pandemic, although obviously the pandemic contributed to a general breakdown of the economy. But this is not the only factor. You have and the danger of war, of course. But the other factor is the general collapse of the culture of the nation. We now have in the United States a series of presidents, especially the Bush family, the Obama administration, and then really we can discuss what happened under Trump, but nothing ended up being changed, really. And now with the new administration, we have a government which encourages its children to take drugs, to smoke marijuana. This is now legal. They're moving towards legalizing even more deadly drugs, who are encouraged to start talking about whether or not they really want to be a boy or a girl at the age of 5 or 6, where the idea that somehow the population can get along without power, without energy, that we don't need fossil fuels or nuclear power, that we can go back to the energy sources that were used before the Industrial Revolution, windmills and the sun, which sustained about 800 million people. Now we now have, 8 billion more than 800 million. So what's going to happen to those 8 billion people? We're not going to be able to sustain them on windmills and solar panels. This is a descent into both madness in the sense of the self-destruction economically, and into madness in terms of international war, a war which, as I mentioned, and as everyone should understand, could be a nuclear war, which is not going to be over there. Americans tend to think that wars are over there. We send our boys to fight for democracy and freedom in little countries that we can crush. Ironically, we've lost virtually every war we fought, but the belief was we could destroy weak little nations. And now this hubris has brought us to a point where we are confronting nuclear-armed powers that are, in fact, stronger economically than we are. And yet this is the level of brainwashing that's taking place in the United States. You know, back when the INF treaty, the Intermediate Range Missile Treaty, was signed by Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev, that was a time where the Soviet Union at that time had SS-20 missiles in Europe, and the U.S. was putting Pershing missiles in Europe. We were literally in a situation where instead of having half an hour to consider what to do if you see the other side sending an intercontinental ballistic missile at you, you now had these short-range missiles in Europe where you had 10 or 15 minutes to decide what to do if a missile's coming at you. And Gorbachev and Reagan recognized that this was insane, that an accident could happen which could wipe out the human race. And they signed this agreement to do away with these missiles. But what I want to point out is that at the time, hundreds of thousands of people were out in the street warning that we were on the brink of nuclear war, and that these were people demanding that we end the madness. Where are those people today? Where is the so-called peace movement? People are so brainwashed, put to sleep emotionally as well as intellectually, that we are on the brink of the extinction of humanity, and there's no peace movement, there's no people out on the street. On the other hand, what we have done through the Schiller Institute is to begin to pull together leading representatives of the leading nations, including Russia, including China, and including our own country and the European countries and other representatives of Africa, Asia, and South America, into forums which have declared that we can and we must use our creative powers to build those alliances that bring reason and sanity back into the world and get the population mobilized behind the idea that this is the moment in which people have to reflect on the value of their lives. What are we living for as individuals? Are we living just to satisfy our physical needs, or just take care of our family or our local community? Well, in normal times, people can get by like that. At a time like this, people are forced by what's taking place to look back and reflect on what they as a human being must think and do in a world which is facing general extinction.
Right. Well, the way we see it, at least from what I gather from what you're saying, Mike, when you brought out the example of United States in terms of a kind of breakdown that might bring us to the so-called new dark age, I would understand that what you're referring to is not just the United States, but the rest of the world is moving towards that kind of breakdown in various levels. Now, I was wondering whether that is the perception of many other people, perception in the sense that there is an economic breakdown crisis that is inherent into the manner their economy is being run, versus, well, the United States, as you pointed out, has brought itself to a certain level which by itself is causing tremendous political instability all over the world. Now, being the largest economy and the leader nation of the world, this kind of instability and breakdown on the U.S. economy is threatening the peace in different parts of the world. Well, in this particular case, probably in the Ukraine issue and in the Taiwan issue, as you pointed out, this is not a Ukraine or Taiwan issue. This is an economic issue. But that economic issue, a large part of it stems from the collapse of the U.S. economy. And where do we go? How do we position ourselves, either to help the United States or to move towards a different paradigm wherein the United States will no longer be the world, the economy which the world depends on? Is that possible?
Well, it is. And of course, it's already taking place. We've had in the last few weeks moves towards sanity being driven by Russia and by China. Xi Jinping went to the World Economic Forum, a virtual meeting last Monday, and gave an extraordinary speech. And this was in the belly of the beast, so to speak. The World Economic Forum is the alliance of the world leading banking institutions and billionaires who are systemically planning the return to the dark age, who are leading the so-called Green New Deal, using the fake science of climate change to basically drive the world back into the Stone Age. So Xi Jinping nonetheless went and spoke there, a very powerful presentation, which made clear that the world has got to change its direction. There has to be a new structure, a new system of the economy, in which the United States, he always spoke in terms of unnamed nations, but clearly the United States and Europe began to work with the rest of the world rather than against the rest of the world. He made clear that now more than 140 countries which have joined the Belt and Road Initiative recognize that there is another force in the world, that the U.S. is not the unipolar single superpower any longer, and that they therefore are not basically subject to this kind of dictatorship. And this is increasing very rapidly. Just in the last few days, literally the last few days, Iran has signed a huge economic deal with China and other deals with Russia. They've carried out military exercises to protect their trade. But this is 25 billion, actually 100 billion over a period of time worth of infrastructure development in Iran in exchange for the oil that the Chinese import from Iran. Syria, just yesterday or the day before, joined the Belt and Road Initiative. The country which has been destroyed by 10 years of warfare, of bombing, which is being a continued war under the so-called Caesar sanctions, where the U.S. in its hubris declared that nobody dare help Syria rebuild itself, or else we will impose sanctions on you for helping the horrible government of Bashar al-Assad. Well, the world is ignoring this. They're ignoring these would-be gods of Olympus who are ordering that nobody is allowed to help Syria rebuild its country, this great historic nation of Syria. Well, China is, and they've joined the Belt and Road. Argentina, Mr. Fernandez, is going to China for the Olympics, but obviously not just for the Olympics, but to hold development discussions with Xi Jinping. And before he goes to China, he's going to go to Russia. So these are just symbols, in a sense. They're very real, but they're symbols of an entire world which is waking up to the fact that continuing to be subservient to the City of London, to the old British Empire, because that's what this is, means death, but that there is an option. And as you know, and as you've discussed with your friends and associates in the Philippines for many, many years, what China has done by adopting the American system of economics has transformed itself from one of the poorest nations on earth into what is at this point clearly the most rapidly developing and actually the biggest economy on earth, truly a miracle, lifting 800 million people out of poverty. This has never been done in human history. What China has done is truly a miracle, an amazing demonstration of what human beings can do if they use their creative powers, that they focus on science and technology and culture. So this is now being taken to the rest of the world. You've of course had this experience in the Philippines with efforts to move towards close collaboration with the Belt and Road. They've been disrupted through various means, some through sabotage, some through the breakdown of the supply chain that's taken place over the last few years. But what we have to look at today is bringing the entire world together around the absolute urgency to end this threat of war, and to do that by addressing the reality of the global economic condition. Give me 1 minute, if you will. I did not get my coffee this morning.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, yan po ang ating ongoing discussion with our good friend Mike Billington. At naasahan po natin masagot niya itong mga ibang nating gustong ilabas na mga katanungan para maintindihan natin mabuti kung ano ang gagawin natin. The situation right now, which I wanted to point out, points to the United States. The onus points to the United States as to what it will do in order to correct the situation, or else the world will try to move towards a new paradigm, and this is exactly what is happening. Yeah, Mike?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, got your coffee. By the way, people don't appreciate the fact that you're with us this morning. At early morning, actually, you had had to wake up at 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the morning just to be
6
with
o'clock. That's okay.
So,
It's always worth it.
Anyway, I was just while you were briefly out, I was just giving a brief on what we have been discussing and what we're still discussing. That there will be a change. There will be a tendency for other countries, to move towards probably the makings of a new paradigm in terms of an economic order. Now, away from the United States. When we say the United States, we're really talking about Wall Street, and the policies that it had influenced the political leadership in the U.S. and Wall Street was influenced by London. Again, the London financial oligarchy that are still in some sort of hegemonic hold of the world economy. And this is what I wanted to point out, Mike. It is this hegemony of the world financial and economic order right now. And as we see this thing starting to implode or collapse, depending on how you want to present it, the United States it's like it's like an attack dog of the London financial oligarchy. I don't know if that's the correct way of saying it, but the kind of influence it has on them has been such in the recent years that it uses the U.S. in order to impose and implement the hegemonic hold on all of the countries, the system, the central banking system, and the cause of collapse of different economies all around the world. Now, what is and if there is a threat to that hegemonic hold posed by the big economies and sovereign nations like China, Russia, and others that might ally themselves with them. Is this the threat of a world war? The refusal to relinquish their control of world economy and by the refusal of the relinquish their hold on the world economy and expect that something that they didn't want to share with the rest of the world?
Well, the U.S. has a chance right now to end this. The Russians, I'm sure this is being covered pretty clearly in the Philippines as well, and people probably know. But what Putin has done is that he has offered 2 treaties, one for the United States and one for NATO, which said, let's return to the time when we made agreements to coexist. The treaties effectively say that the U.S. will not put missiles on its border. It will not allow Ukraine to become part of NATO, which of course would mean that the NATO forces were right on the Russian border. And it also calls for them to actually not expand NATO, but to actually retract back to what it was in 1997 when it was first set up. There is no reason for the U.S. not to sign this. These agreements were set up by far more sensible leaders in the United States, under Kennedy, under Reagan, and others, in order to prevent a descent into hell. And there's no reason not to go back to that. Keep in mind that when Russia says you must not put those intermediate range missiles on our border, those offensive missiles, And the United States people like Mr. Blinken, our foreign minister, who's another example of the so-called chicken hawks, people who have never been at war but like to send people to war. He actually was involved in provoking the wars in Iraq and Libya and Syria, these criminal, illegal, genocidal wars. But when they say no nation has the right to tell another sovereign nation like Ukraine how it's going to defend itself, we will not agree to telling our friend and ally Ukraine that they may not join NATO or that they may not have the missiles they need for their defense. Well, yesterday at our program, Harley Schlanger read the statement by John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis,
Right.
in which he said it is absolutely unreasonable to expect that this nation will allow the deployment of nuclear weapons within a few minutes of our borders. No nation could accept this. And of course, they took an act of war. A blockade is, in a sense, an act of war, not military, not shooting war, but they blockaded. And because we had sensible leaders, John Kennedy, his brother Bobby, meeting with Brezhnev and with the representatives of the Soviet Union, they were able to prevent what was very, very close to becoming a war, which most likely would have been a nuclear war. And they made a deal, basically. They agreed to pull our missiles out of Turkey. They didn't publicly state that was the deal, but they were smart enough to make a deal privately to prevent nuclear war. And then new agreements were made to bring about sanity, not deploying these intermediate range missiles in Europe. So there's no reason the U.S. should not sign these treaties. The idea that somehow this is Russia being aggressive and pushy and demanding things, this is a reverse Cuban Missile Crisis, and the sane position is to do what Kennedy and Brezhnev and the Soviets did back at that time and end the madness, and then sit down and start talking about how to deal with the real problems that face humanity, which is not this fake charge that Russia and China are being aggressive, nations whose troops are all within their own borders, who are not waging war against any other country, so forth. But to get down to actually come together and do what Lyndon LaRouche called for when he called for the so-called four powers, which meant Russia and China and India and the United States, and then all other nations who would join, who could come together to have a new Bretton Woods to replace this bankrupt British system that now dominates London and New York, and to put together a policy of peace through development, joining with the Belt and Road, which is the one way that our own industries can, again, get back to the business that Roosevelt wanted them to do, which was to use American system development policies to build the former colonies of the European nations into modern industrial nations. In other words, to join with China in doing what China is doing already through the Belt and Road. There's every reason to be optimistic. This is a moment of decision. These next few days and weeks could very well determine the fate of the human race as a whole, depending on how this is dealt with over this showdown between the empire, the dying empire, and the new paradigm that has already emerged through Russia and China, but which is literally bringing the world together around the ideas of development.
Yeah. Well, the conditions with regard to that thing, if I recall right, Mike, on the Cuban Missile Crisis, was that the U.S. was far superior in terms of military capabilities than Khrushchev's Russia at that time, the Soviet Union. So they could actually face down the Russian threat. But in this particular case, although the principle by which Putin is demanding that these things be done by U.S. and NATO, U.S. and NATO combined feel that they are superior to that of the Russians. Therefore, I am very much concerned that the U.S. and the NATO people will not stand down, and because they feel they are militarily superior. In which case, if that's the situation and the kind
Well, I don't think so, Butch. You know, the public statements, you would think that's what they believe. But in fact, there are people in our military, there are people in our intelligence community who recognize the obvious fact that the U.S. could not win a war in Ukraine, and they could not win a war over Taiwan. They know this. The U.S. is not the only military power in the world either. As we've seen, they couldn't even beat a couple 100,000 mullahs in the caves of Afghanistan. After 20 years of mass destruction, we finally had to pull out. It was the right thing to pull out. What's being done to Afghanistan today is one of the great atrocities of history. Having 20 years destroying that country, now we have cut off all aid. We've basically seized $9+ billion of their bank's reserves, which we refuse to give over to them. We've cut off the IMF and the World Bank funding. This is a country which is now facing the death by freezing and starvation over this winter of, under the estimate of the World Food Program leader, David Beasley, 24 million people. This would make Hitler blush, and yet this is being done right now by this government in the United States and their so-called allies. So things like this are taking place, but their people recognize that we couldn't win. That's why Putin moved 100,000 or so troops to the Ukrainian border, and then said, "What are you going to do if there is a war?" And what was the response? The U.S. and every one of its allies said, "We will not go in and defend Ukraine militarily." See, this is very important. They bluster that we're going to impose horrible sanctions on Russia. They're going to absolutely destroy their economy with sanctions. But you have to notice they are not saying we will deploy militarily. And in fact, they say openly, we will not. So this is very important. And even the sanctions policy that they're threatening against Russia, for instance, they were saying they were going to throw them out of the SWIFT system, which is the system that's used for international trade to do the financing of international trade. Well, the rest of Europe is saying, you better not, that would destroy us. If you were to break down the SWIFT system, the entire financial system worldwide would go into a tailspin collapse. So there are those who are, basically Putin recognized that at this point, there's no reason to simply allow this madness to continue. And he therefore has thrown down the gauntlet and said, you have to face the fact, United States, that you're no longer the absolute power on earth. You're not the gods of Olympus. And therefore, we have to work together. Now, Russia has no intention of invading, but by moving forces up, they were able to flush out the reality and force the madness within Ukraine. They know there's a bunch of hotheads in there. Neo-Nazis who were put in power by the U.S.-run coup in 2014, who think that they could attack the Donbas area, the area of the so-called republics of the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, who are Ukrainian citizens, but who could not put up with the Nazis that took over in 2014, who were telling them they couldn't speak Russian, they couldn't educate their children in Russian, and other kinds of outright fascist policies they were trying to implement. So this area of the Donbas, if Zelensky and the Ukrainians thought they could militarily attack the Donbas without Russia defending what they consider their citizens who live in Ukraine, they've been disabused of that. It's been made clear to them that the West will not come in and defend them militarily. That's not to say the crisis is over, because we're still arming them massively, and there still is the chance of that kind of madness. And then look at Taiwan. The same thing is true in Taiwan. There's no way the U.S. could defend Taiwan. As Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who I think you watched the interview I did with Ambassador Chaz Freeman,
Yes.
who is unquestionably our finest diplomat, China scholar, China expert, who said very clearly in the interview that the U.S. has crossed the red line of China, threatening to support the breakup of their country by separating Taiwan from the one China policy. But there's no way we could defeat them. This is not the China of the 1950s. China also has nuclear weapons. And as he put it, do we really want to defend so-called democracy in Taiwan in exchange for losing Chicago? Which is a rather hair-raising way to put it. But that is the situation. And the same thing is true in the case of Russia. The problem, as you know, that people have to think about is if we end up in a war, which can be started by accident, so-called, the sleepwalking into war, and the U.S. and the British recognize that they are losing, there are madmen in our leadership who would say, well, then let's use nuclear weapons. Now, that doesn't mean the U.S. would win. It would mean the human race would lose. But there are such madmen. The head of our strategic command, Admiral Richard, this is the man who would push the button if the president said to push the button. He said last year that while in the past we considered it unlikely there would be a nuclear war because of the rise of Russia and China, therefore it is possible that there will be a nuclear war, even likely. This is madness. And as you probably know, one of our mad senators, Senator Wicker, who is the number 2 on the Senate Armed Forces Committee, so this is a person with power in our Congress, openly said that we should prepare to bomb Russia back to the Stone Age, and we should even consider a first nuclear strike, a first-use nuclear strike. This is being discussed openly in our Congress, in our press. So the danger is there. But it is important to keep in mind that there is a new paradigm in construction in the world, which takes on both the economic potential of global cooperation through the Belt and Road, but also for a new strategic infrastructure, a new strategic bringing the world together to guarantee all of our security and ending this nuclear confrontation idea once and for all. So it's one of those moments. I always remember Lyndon LaRouche would refer to Percy Shelley, who in his the British poet, who was a strong political activist against the tyranny within England. But in his book, In the Defense of Poetry, he talks about a moment just like this, when the existing system fails to sustain the population and the economies, and there is a crisis of civilization like this, the threat of a new dark age. He says, at such moments, people suddenly become more capable of considering profound ideas about the nature of man and the nature of the universe, of science, and of society. And because they are forced to throw away their delusions that somehow the world is going to take care of itself and the individual doesn't have any role in that. They're suddenly forced to realize, what is my role? Why am I here on earth? What is my life worth if I'm sitting by watching humanity destroyed? We're all mortal. We're all going to die. But when we do come to death, are we able to look back and say that my life was worth living, that I did something to create the future of humanity? You know, individual man is mortal, but mankind is immortal. And our immortality comes through our using those God-given powers of creativity to do in our short moment of life, to use the talents given to us in a way which will create a better future for our posterity. And at moments like this, Shelley said, this is when the poet becomes the legislator of history. This is when the ability of each and every person to begin to use those creative powers that most people unfortunately put aside during their lives and think only about their material needs, rather than the creative potential of acting as a citizen of the world, a citizen of one's nation, a patriot of one's nation, but a citizen of the human race. So this is the time where LaRouche, who always represented the human race as a whole in his thinking, this is where these ideas have the potential of doing tremendous good. So like I've been describing the horrible danger of the situation, and yet this is a moment of tremendous opportunity. I first met Lyndon LaRouche in 1971, and what I remember most from that conference, this was right after Nixon took the dollar off of gold, the beginning of the casino economy. But he said, this is going to cause depressions, hyperinflation, pandemics. He even warned of pandemics because he said they were going to take down our health system this way, and wars, and eventually big wars. And people won't want to hear my warning that this is where we're heading. In only a few people here and there, people like Butch Valdes, who will heed that warning and build an organization in the Philippines to join in that fight. But when it happens, he said, at that point, people will look back to see who was lying and who was telling them the truth. So we have to tell the truth, even though it doesn't make us popular in the normal popular sense. And over these last 50 years, we've told the truth. And what is happening now, I think, is exactly what Lynn said, that people are waking up, they are turning to us. The interviews I've done that you've mentioned, Butch, with Ambassador Chaz Freeman, with the former CIA official Graham Fuller, with Justin Lin, China's leading economist, and others. These are people who recognize that the LaRouche movement is now the key center for bringing the world together with around the power of great ideas, which is what's required if we're going to get out of this strategic crisis.
Yeah, on a matter very close to our situation now, and I guess it's also happening all over the world. Let me shift to this effects of the pandemic that is now afflicting the whole world. There is it seems like a concerted effort on the part of governments to try to mandate vaccinations for on the people, and the kind of vaccinations starting to be explained do not seem to have an end to it. Meaning, governments are trying to explain that this might have to be done every 3 months and so on and so forth. Now, there is a reaction, very negative reaction to by many people here, and we can also see all over the world, in Europe especially, and in the United States, that these mandates are going against basic human rights and the right to life and the other things that we fight for. How does the LaRouche organization look at this? Well, we understand, of course, the situation about not being prepared and not having the health infrastructure that might be causing this whole pandemic. But then, what about the reaction of governments to impose this? There seems it's like a middle of the road thing. We don't know whether to follow government or stand up for our rights.
I don't think the issue is vaccines. I don't think you should sort of pass over. Of course, we understand the lack of health infrastructure. There's only one reason that in China, fewer than 5,000 people have died from COVID, whereas in the United States, we're now well over 800,000 in the United States alone. We have millions of new cases of the Omicron variant taking place around the world every day. Why? It's not a question only of vaccines. Vaccines have a role. You know, our children are not allowed to go to school unless they have vaccinations against measles and whooping cough and polio, I think. You know, there are reasons for people to have vaccines. There's no mandate for the flu vaccine, but this is a virus, a pandemic, far worse than influenza, as evidenced by the fact that just in the U.S. alone, which is where there's more deaths than anywhere else, 800,000 deaths, whereas the flu kills 30 million or 30,000 or so every year, but this is 800,000. But the point is that there's a reason that they were able to prevent that kind of mass death in China, which is that they used their medical infrastructure to beat it. Now, I mentioned before that LaRouche warned in 1971 there would be pandemics. And there have been other pandemics, AIDS and SARS-1 and so forth, and Ebola. Why? When you don't allow the developing sector to have modern health facilities, and in Africa, where half the population doesn't even have electricity, and a similar proportion does not have clean water, and let alone hospitals, doctors, and nurses, and so forth. But you can't have a competent modern health system if you don't have that kind of basic infrastructure. And they don't have that kind of capacity. And at the same time, in England and the United States, our health system was systemically taken down. We've shut down thousands of hospitals over the last 30 years, shut them down. Why? Because we stopped having a health system that was based on the needs of health care. And instead, we turned it over through the privatization of healthcare, turned it over to Wall Street and their insurance companies, who made the determination that if a hospital wasn't profitable, then it should be shut down. And literally thousands of hospitals have been shut down, in awaiting the next disaster. Our health industries producing the medicines and the things needed for healthcare became just on time production, so that when this hit, we were simply unprepared to deal with it. And then you have the hoarding of vaccines from the third world. You now have a situation where the World Health Organization and others have made very clear that the hoarding of these vaccines and the denial of access to the vaccines in Africa and South America have created a situation in which these become petri dishes where their immune systems are weaker, that therefore new variants emerge, and they will continue to emerge, and there will be new viruses that emerge. And therefore, the issue is, can we build modern health facilities in every country in the world, or will we not? This is the basis on which we can start the effort to have the Belt and Road idea. This idea of building nations throughout the world has to start with a modern health system for every country. And in particular, as I mentioned before, we should start in Afghanistan, a place which is being subjected to hell, to genocide. And it's on our conscience, it's on our hands if we allow this to take place. The entire health system in Afghanistan was financed by the World Bank for 20 years of the US NATO occupation of that country. And on the day that the US left, they ordered the World Bank to stop all payments. The result now is that there's very few hospitals even open in Afghanistan, and there's no medicine, there's no money, there's very little food, and therefore we have something that, we look back at the Hitler, at the genocide by Hitler. This is worse. And yet the world is sitting by allowing the United States to continue these sanctions, this boycott. How do we end it? We start with modern healthcare. We have to bring the world together and to begin this process by the emergency aid that needs to be brought in to deal with the health, the food, and the healthcare for this population. Helga, as you know, Helga LaRouche has founded an organization called the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, a term that comes from Nicholas of Cusa, the genius who really gave rise to the Christian Renaissance in Europe, that by addressing that common need of mankind to be able to have modern health care, that this is the basis on which we can and we must begin the reversal of this descent into a dark age and to begin the process of building the world rather than destroying it.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that the direction has to be towards building the infrastructure needed to prevent pandemics. But the present condition seems to, when we put things together, that there are people that want to be able to control the world. And historically, there are people like Bertrand Russell and Prince Philip and many other people that have been talking about how they were going to try to cut down population. Prince Philip specifically saying that he would like to be a especially deadly virus to make his contribution to world population. There were people that are thinking along the lines of depopulation, and they are around. They are very much alive. And they're probably using all of their resources to be able to do such a thing, because for whatever reason they might have, as the Kissinger memorandum, the NSSM 200 said before that U.S. has to go into a population control program, and that included he mentioned something like 13 or 14 countries, including the Philippines. And the reason for that was because these people were using up the natural resources that should have been that should be left to the United States for its use. Now there are such things that we're thinking along those lines. What I'm trying to say is we cannot discount the very strong possibility that whatever is happening now in terms of surges in mortality is just purely because people do not have the infrastructure. Our own statistics here that we gathered showed that in the whole year of 2020, from the time COVID was supposed to be declared as pandemic, and up to the end of 2020, and up to the 2 months, 3 months of 2021, our mortality rate did not change from the normal. In other words, the kind of mortality rate we had was almost the same as that of the previous years when there was no such pandemic. However, when March, April, May, all the way up to September went through, the statistics of our own government agencies showed there was a spike from the normal, in some cases of 92% from normal, and others averaged out to about 20 to 25% for these whole 6 months alone, above the normal death rate. Now, these statistics coincide with a major program of practically forcing vaccinations on our people. And all of those, of course, the statistics as to whether those that have died are vaccinated or not are very much guarded, and we don't find them. But many reports coming in from different sources show that people have been vaccinated twice and taken the booster and died after getting the booster shot. Some have died within the week, some have died months after, but there was a boost in mortality. Now, this is very concerning because if this is the case, and we replicate this all over the world, indeed, the depopulationists might seem to be getting their way. Or especially deadly virus was released.
Yeah, you know I disagree with you on this issue of the vaccines and the mandates and so forth. I think what you have to consider is, first of all, if the vaccine itself was a killer, I think probably the British and the British-style leadership in America would have made sure that the vaccines went to Africa first, because they're so racist. They would like to see them go first. But again, more important is there is a policy of genocide. It's allowing viruses to spread. But the more important thing at this point is that the British Empire, in the form of the banking system, and that's always what the empire has been. It's always been a financial empire centered in the City of London and the private sector's role. That private sector has now completely taken over from government. The US government no longer runs the economy. The British government never did run the economy. The banks did. Now that's true in the United States. And at the Glasgow COP26 summit last month, while the world basically said, go to hell, we're not going to shut down our fossil fuels, the vast majority of the world, Russia, China, India, right? That's why they are seen as the enemy, is because they're not going along with this genocide program of shutting down their fossil fuels and going backwards. But the bankers at that event formed a cartel. They call it GFANZ, Glasgow Financial Associates for Net Zero. This is all the Western banks, no Asian banks are part of this. But that cartel said explicitly, Mark Carney, former head of the Bank of England, said governments will not do what they must do to save the planet from this fake science of carbon causing climate change. Therefore, we bankers will do it. And they are doing it. This is taking place already. The cutting of credit needed for the economies, and this includes for healthcare. Now, the Chinese have what they call a Chinese Silk Road. They're building hospitals all around the world. They're building vaccine production capacities in Africa and elsewhere in South America. The Russians are doing some of the same. The U.S. is doing the opposite. So the danger is at the highest level not to be diverted into issues which are going to take away from the fact that we're facing a new dark age, because the entire world is being taken over by this financial cartel, literally in the same form that in Nazi Germany, Hitler brought in Hjalmar Schacht, whom you know well, to run the economy, so that the financial system ran the economy rather than a government that was committed to building things. So all they built was military. Everything else was basically destroyed. And this is what's taking place right now throughout the world. Right. The pandemic is a piece of that, but it's being done on the economy as a whole. And I think it's better not to be diverted into fights over things that are going to address that.
There is no diversion. I'm sorry to say, Mike, but no, there's no diversion in what I'm saying. You refer to the dark ages. All of that had happened. Collapse of the financial economy happened, and so on and so forth. Healthcare was out. And it wiped out half the population of Europe. And that was the dark ages. What is going to happen here is everything is going to happen. And it will wipe out maybe half the population of the world or even more. This is what I'm saying. There's no diversion of this. The fact that it is there. And we cannot dilute or lessen that this other thing that is happening could be precisely a weapon towards trying to maintain hegemony, towards those evil-minded people wanting to stay in control of the world. And the rest of us are going to oppose it. Now, they use different weapons, of course. And this is one of those that we feel is that it is not diverting from the issue.
Well, I would argue,
as a matter of fact, complementing. That is what I'm saying.
Well, I think the China case has to be examined very closely. Everybody is getting vaccinated in China, but that's not what is preventing the mass death. The vaccines help, but what's preventing the mass death is the modern health system that they build. That, when needed, they can build a hospital in a week. We've seen that. But that's why people are not dying in China. They have the zero virus policy. It's being crushed everywhere it shows up. And the reason we didn't do that in the United States is economic. We've discussed it, but it's also social, because there is this kind of, we're not going to allow you to build a modern system and force people into quarantine if they have the virus. We're just not going to allow it. We're free people, and we're not going to allow this to happen. Yeah. Well, this is a problem which is going to have to be resolved really culturally by getting people to think about the fact that they have a role in the world as a whole, for the human race as a whole, and not to think only about my ability to do whatever I want. And this is where the legalization of drugs comes from. This is where all this kind of stuff comes from. Is the nationalization of this anarchist kind of personal freedoms over the freedom of the human race as a whole to develop their creative powers and to actually advance humanity. And that's where we have to focus our efforts. Look, I remember that studying the health system in the Philippines long before the pandemic. It's an absolute disaster. As I'm sure you know,
Yes.
many thousands of your doctors left the Philippines and came here to function as nurses
Yes.
because of the disaster of the health system in the Philippines, which certainly has not improved. And I think that is the reality that we have to address for the Philippines and for every other country, that we have to resolve.
There's no doubt that we have been not remiss, but we have been in such a situation of economic activity that have been controlled and imposed by foreign financial oligarchs. That's exactly how this had happened, and you know that very well. But the point of the matter that I'm saying is that yes, there is all of these things that are, but to use China as the example, yes, they have the best healthcare system. Why? Because they have been able to foresee something like this, and having 1.4 billion people, they've had the autonomy and independence to fund many of the preparations for infrastructure. Countries like us, no, didn't have any such capabilities. And the other thing with China is that being an authoritarian form of government, they can impose. And it's necessary. They impose police efforts and everybody stays inside. Now, for people like us, people like there in the United States and different parts, we're not used to that. And when something is imposed on us, our nature as human beings necessarily has to object to it. It might be for our own good. I'm not saying it might not be or it might be. But any kind of imposition of government with regard to this, because the equivalent of these impositions are things like inability to make a living, inability to go to work, inability to earn something, inability to go to the market to buy what your food needs for the day would be, inability to go to the drugstore to buy the medicines you need. All of these things are results of an imposition of mandatory vaccination. You stay home or else we will catch you. The order has been given to arrest those that are not vaccinated. Now, these are things that are that we necessarily have to object to as human beings, not just as Filipinos. Anywhere in the world that something like this is happening, I'm sure you will react to it. There are others, because of fear, will follow. And that's exactly what they want. That out of fear, you just follow. Like human cattle being led to the slaughterhouse. And this is what are the conditions not here in the Philippines, that I'm sure the same thing all over the world. Now, this method is not different from the kind of thinking of those people that want to keep their hegemony over the rest of the world. I am saying that those that are been remiss or those that have imposed a economic system on us that deteriorated the life of all human beings for the past how many decades now, are still at it. And it has reached the point where their system has already failed, and they are going to be more assertive and more militaristic in imposing themselves on humankind.
You remember the Edgar Allan Poe story, The Mask of the Red Death? Did you ever read that?
I think so, but I don't remember.
It's good. It's good to read it. This is Poe was a real genius, and The Mask of the Red Death is about the oligarchy in the midst of a pandemic, which of course they provoked, whether consciously or not. But in the midst of this pandemic, the lords and ladies decide to hold a grand ball in their castle and completely close off the whole castle and basically let the pandemic sweep through the villages and the towns while they party in their castle.
Wow.
And then an unexpected guest shows up dressed in a red mask. And I think you can imagine what takes place then. He goes through the different rooms of the palace. And of course, this is the virus which comes home to kill the oligarchs. This is a situation where I think you can look at the pandemic as sort of an image for what the gods of Olympus have done. They are bringing down the world on top of them. Lynn used to talk about the oligarchs as if these were the gods of Olympus sitting on a mountain, throwing out their orders. You shall do this. You shall do that. I am your Lord, the gods of Olympus. Do this, do that. And they don't notice that the mountain is crumbling underneath them.
Right.
This is the situation. There is a new world out there. It's a new world that has been put together. And the LaRouche movement played a very significant role in this, in building up modern China, in working with their friends in Russia. Remember when the Soviet Union fell, Lyndon LaRouche was brought in by the scientists and the economists in Russia for meetings and seminars to understand LaRouche's economics, to understand that there is a way to put the world together that's based on the creative power of ideas and bringing those ideas into play through discovering principles of the universe, turning those into machine tools which lift the productivity of the population as a whole. All of this is now in place in the form of this new Russia, China, and Belt and Road movement, which has to be the basis upon which we do what we've set out to do: bring development, starting with modern healthcare systems, to every country in the world. Our ability to do that or to fail to do that is going to depend on what happens over these next few weeks with whether or not this showdown between the Olympian gods in London and New York on Wall Street can be defeated in favor of the real American system, joining with Russia and China to bring about that new paradigm for mankind. These are the issues that people have to be focused on. We can succeed in this. This is a moment of optimism, despite the fact that it's obviously a horrendous danger. But we have to act on that optimism by bringing people to look at themselves as citizens of the world and to join in this expanding movement for sanity around the LaRouche movement. So I think that's.
Yes, I will certainly take a look at what you mentioned about Edgar Allan Poe's Red Mask. Definitely a review. And I want to ask Itos, who has been very quiet and had allowed me to take on the discussion. But I am sure there are certain things in his mind that he wants to discuss or ask you, Mike. Go ahead, Itos.
Yeah, Mike. I guess we have about 20 minutes left on the show, but just on your last point on the new paradigm, the new the great powers have to get together. LaRouche's blueprint for the world economy to get back on track. I just wanted to get your sense of how you see these things playing out, at least in the immediate period, given that the U.S. under this new administration seems to be going back to, seems to have returned to the foreign policy of Obama, and even to a certain extent, George Bush Jr. We had the 4 years of Trump where he seemed to have reached out and said Xi Jinping and Putin, seem to have done that. And right now we have, as expected, tension immediately with Ukraine using NATO and Putin. Given also that, as you mentioned, world economy is now being controlled by these elite, the people who go to who attend the World Economic Forum, and all of these guys. And like they said, they have the power and the muscle to implement things, even if governments don't want them to. So also in that context, how then, given that their system is already has been disintegrating for a while, and with the World Economic Forum claiming that they will start to implement what they call the Great Reset, which obviously is, we don't want any of that coming from them. But how do you think in the near period these things will unfold, given the seeming opposition of the United States on this, getting together with China and Russia and India, as LaRouche would say?
So keep in mind that Biden, who people know he has early cognitive problems, he's a total greenie. He completely supports the whole Green New Deal. Actually, not as extreme as the extreme greenies. Economically, he has very little sense of things. But on the other hand, he appears to not want a nuclear war. So you have the irony of Biden, despite the fact that he has an administration full of war hawks, having long meetings with Putin, long meetings with Xi Jinping. And he set in motion the dialogue that's taking place now between the U.S. and Russia. Whether or not his being an old line Democrat who tends to recognize that we don't want a nuclear war can succeed is not really dependent on Biden. I think it's important for people to look at what happened with Trump. I wrote an article last year called Why Trump Failed and Why Many Trump Supporters Failed to Understand Why. Because when he got elected by a population that was absolutely thrilled to see somebody who came in and said, we should be friends with Russia. It's a good thing, not a bad thing, to be friends with Russia. We should be friends with China, although we have a trade problem, but other than the trade problem, we should be friends. He did a trip to China where he praised Xi Jinping as a great leader and China as a great nation. But what happened? He said we should end the regime change wars. He said we should rebuild the economy. But what happened? He appointed warmongers to run the military. And when he said get out of Syria, they told him to drop dead. He said we should rebuild the economy and said we should start generating credit for infrastructure and industry. And Wall Street said, drop dead. We're going to bail out the banks. He said we're going to be friends with China. And then his cabinet, the Pompeos and the Navarros, said, I'm not going to let you be friends with China. And Trump finally gave in and blamed the pandemic on China. Why? Because he thought China was guilty? No. He told the truth about it for the first 6 or 7 months, but he finally was convinced that he needed to blame somebody for the failed response in the United States. So he said, well, it's the China virus, right? The point is that the president doesn't run the country. Had he done what we proposed he do, and that friends of ours like Roger Stone tried to convince him to do, and exonerated Lyndon LaRouche, then he could have brought in people who believed in what he said he wanted to do, meaning people like myself, to run his cabinet, and we would have had a prosperous global development policy. But he didn't. He wasn't willing quite to put up with what LaRouche was subjected to by the British and by the media. And as a result, he appointed his enemies to run his economy from Wall Street. He appointed his enemies in the military-industrial complex to run his defense posture, and they failed. So the result is he was not able to do anything he said. Why? Because the president doesn't run the country alone. Lynn always talked about the institution of the presidency, which includes the president, but it includes other politicians, other private sector people, other strategists like LaRouche. And in the case of Ronald Reagan, for instance, LaRouche was part of that institution of the presidency, and we were able to get the Strategic Defense Initiative and other good things. That's another story for now. But the question today is, can we bring our international movement, which is part of the institution of the presidency through our movement, to create a circumstance in which the U.S. is forced basically to admit its actual self-interests lie in cooperation with the Belt and Road, not with the bankrupt Western financial system trying to loot the rest of the world. And this is something that can happen. The whole Green New Deal thing can be turned on its head. So there's reason to be optimistic that we can, in this moment of crisis, when everybody is forced to rethink what they think about how the world is run, that we can bring those forces together to create a circumstance which will make all of this possible. Can we guarantee that? No. But we can be optimistic that this is going to happen, not by hoping that Biden's going to do it, but by hoping that he and other people who have at least some semblance of sanity regarding the war, that we make that the basis on which we bring the US and Russia and China together to end the wars, to address the absolute disaster taking place in Afghanistan, which is in everybody's self-interest. And by getting people to think about their actual self-interest, you then can address these other bigger problems of a new Bretton Woods system and a new strategic environment for the world. That's where we stand.
Yeah, okay. Itas, any follow-ups?
No more. We have about 10 minutes left. So
Okay. Yeah, well, let me, on behalf of the Philippine LaRouche Society and our Save the Nation movement, Mike, let me express our deep gratitude for your continuous accommodating us here in far part of the world. And we continue, of course, appreciating our friendship, and we hope that things through you, through us, and through all of those that are thinking correctly in the LaRouche organization are able to change the direction in which the world is going this coming periods.
yeah,
So,
I'd like to ask Mike also if you have any parting words for our everybody here who's listening to us on YouTube and on radio in the Philippines and even on Facebook. So the floor is yours, Mike.
Well, as LaRouche always said, the Philippines plays a very, very crucial role between East and West. It has one foot in the East and one foot in the West. Being an Asian nation, but having a Christian culture from the unfortunate side of colonialism under Spain and so forth, but nonetheless created a concept of Western civilization within the Philippines, which can be a very valuable resource in bringing the East and the West together. You're living through a horrible moment in history in terms of the impact of the global financial breakdown crisis over these last 20 years. On top of that, this pandemic, now the danger of war. This is a moment of great crisis. But the fact that Butch Valdes and Itos and Anton and Ver and Kathy and others who have helped build your organization in the Philippines, being able to stand up to power, not only the power of the oligarchy within the Philippines, but to stand up to power internationally as a voice of reason in the midst of the insanity. This is a very valuable resource for humanity that you have maintained this fight for all these years within the Philippines, and that now that we've reached the moment of truth, the urgency that we bring like-minded forces throughout the world, forces for the good, forces who believe that man is truly born in the image of God with the creative power to create a future of dignity for mankind. That this is a moment where the world will be watching you, and hopefully the Philippine people will continue responding to your morality and your leadership, along with us in this international fight for the future of mankind. So we greet you with fondness and with hope. We are relatively optimistic that we can succeed not just in stopping this disaster, but truly launching a new renaissance for mankind, where every culture, the Islamic, the Confucian, the Christian, every culture reaches back to its greatest moments, where it advanced mankind as a whole through their own renaissance, and this time create a true renaissance of humanity as a whole, which is the only way we can succeed at this point, but it also is this rare moment in human history in which it's possible to truly bring the human race together around a common aim of advancing humanity's role on Earth and in the universe. So it's a great moment. I greet you from all of the LaRouche movement, all of your friends and supporters. We wish you well in this great moment in history.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much again, and we hope that we'll be seeing you again, especially as events happen or do not happen.
And let me know when you get to be president, okay, Butch?
Now we're working out something for the country, wherein a special person that we know has the capability, the youth and the intellectual capacity and moral courage to take the lead of this country, and we will be very much in support of him.
Good.
Okay, Mike.
Okay, thanks a lot. See you.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Iyan na po si Mike Billington, who was our guest for the show, and as usual, he's more part of our own family, as he and his wife used to. They have a special fondness for the Philippines and a special friendship with our family, and by extension to all of you.
Yeah.
So, Chairman, we
Yeah.
have 3 minutes left.
Tayo kay Mike.
Yeah.
Yeah, meron ba tayong mga messages, reactions?
Meron, pero we have 3 minutes left. before we're cut off sa radio, ha?
Never mind.
So,
Okay.
baka may extra ka pa.
Di na. Yun
Ah,
lang ano. Gusto ko marinig yung mga comments.
okay. Hannah Segundo, Abangers, Carlo EY, he put a link. Zenea Arcilla, good evening, Professor Butch and Sir Itos. God bless you more. Keep safe. Happy blessed birthday po. Stay healthy po. Fredo Redina, USA, NATO, pinapaligiran ng Russia, mainly Ukraine situation. Welcome to Mike Billington. Mamerto Lawrence, bagong pagkakitaan, walang tigil ang hanap buhay nila. Brixton Roel, Francisco Morata. Good evening po mga sir, watching from Davao City. Gloria Berting Bondok, good evening po Sir Butch, Sir Itos. Rayaj Lognot, good evening po Sir Butch, Sir Itos. God bless po mga from Pampanga. Ray Val, mabuhay Prof. Butch, Bro Itos. Salamat sa walang sawang pagpapiwang ng totoong status ng bansa natin, ng buong mundo at mga alternative solution na pwede natin gawin bilang isang matatag na bansa para manatili tayong nakatayo as a nation. Thank you. Salamat Prof. Butch and Bro Itos. Ferdimar Aga Ventura, paano po sumali sa inyo?
Pasok ko lang
Alicia,
sa website natin. Yeah, Itos, maybe medyo we've lost time already. Let me
sige.
let me say goodbye to our friends. Maraming salamat po sa ngalan po ng ating mga katipon dito, sa ang ating katipunan at sa magagaling na staff ng DZXL Radio Mo Nationwide. Kami po ay pansamantala nagpapaalam at nagpapasalamat na sinamahan niyo kami ngayon, ang ora de peligro ng ating bayan at ng buong mundo dito po sa ating katipunan. Hanggang sa linggo po muli, mga katipon, 7 to 9 p.m. Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat.